Halito, and welcome to Native Chalk Talk, a podcast by natives for all. Here we're keeping our Native ancestors' stories and history alive, while also sharing with you our Native culture, traditions, and more. I'm Rachel Youngman, a Choctaw originally from Anadarko, Oklahoma. I hope you'll enjoy this journey with me as we learn from our Native American guests. And I hope you'll do me a favor. Feel free to like and share these episodes. I so appreciate it. Yakuki.
There's already pieces that I made that are being passed down. I'd rather take my time with everything because pieces hold significance to the person. It's an incredible feeling seeing someone else wear things that I make.
See and share our stories at togetherwe'remore.com.
Though he may have grown up near Chicago, amidst the bustle of city life, the roar of passenger trains, and the shadow of towering skyscrapers, the native in the man lived on. He once dedicated himself to crafting horror comic books with dark and haunting imagery, but over time, a different calling emerged. His ancestors urged him to reconnect with his heritage, inspiring him to weave the native world into his storytelling. My guest today is the talented Ho Chunk comic book artist Jim Terry, known for his work in Marvel Comics Voices, Alice Cooper versus Chaos, The Crow, Skinning the Wolves, West of Sundown, and much more. And as a finalist of the LA Times Book Prize for his comic Come Home Indio, and for his recent selection as artist in residence at the Newberry Library, where he created Paper Cuts, graphic novel commissioned by Indigenous Chicago. Jim, welcome to Native Choctaw.
Hi, nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
You know what's cool about you and I is we don't live that far from each other. And that rarely happens, as most Native Americans I know are in my home state in Oklahoma. So, hello to you, my Ho Chunk friend living near me.
Oh, it's nice to be here.
Absolutely. So, your artwork in your comics is fantastic. And as mentioned, you have a long history of horror type comics, but the two I want to focus on today are a bit different from your typical genre: Come Home Indio and Paper Cuts. So, what inspired you to write the memoir Come Home Indio?
Well, it's a pretty involved story. I can give you the Cliff's Notes version.
Sure.
Um, I don't, it was really at the behest of Liz Francis, who was starting her own company, publishing company called Street Noise, which the idea was to focus on marginalized voices.
Mm.
And she had been following me, and she knew that I mean, on social media, not in a car.
Not stalking you or anything.
Yeah,
That's good.
but she had been following me, and she knew that I had been at Standing Rock, and asked if she approached me at a convention and asked if I was interested in talking about doing a book about Standing Rock, which I was not, because I wasn't there long enough to consider myself an authority on it,
Okay.
and nor did I see myself as an ambassador of anything. As you see, if you read the book, I was a witness for a short period of time, so I didn't feel comfortable talking about it in depth as its own thing. But she was persistent and convinced me to tell my story, because I didn't think that talking about my experience at Standing Rock, which was profound to me. It had a profound effect on me. But I don't think that the gravity of it would have any weight if the reader didn't understand where I came from. So
Mm.
I had to go back to the beginning and just talk about all the things that as briefly as I could, kind of make up who I am and the things that I struggle with. Why do I struggle with certain things? Well, it might be because of this, it might not, who knows? Um, but to get to a place where you're in the car with me and my sister and my cousin, and we're pulling up to Standing Rock, and hopefully at that point you understand why I'm anxious and why I'm nervous, because you've been with me on this journey, and why what happens shortly after was such a uh, profound and moving thing for me. So that is the most succinct way I can talk about the motivation behind doing something as grandiose as a memoir, because I'm generally a fairly private person, and it was terrifying to do something like that. But the idea of something doing telling your story is hopefully to be helpful to somebody else,
So true.
and
Was
so
it also kind of healing for you to put it all on paper?
I think that eventually it felt that way once the buzzing of the head subsided a little bit and some time had passed. I realized that organizing my thoughts and reflecting on things from a different perspective, an older perspective, things that happened when I was young, I was suddenly able. Okay, now I'm telling this story. I have to try and understand why people behaved the way that they did
Hmm.
differently than when it's just happening, and I'm a kid and I'm reacting to things that are happening around me. Now I'm telling the story, and it's like, why did they do that, and it's given me a broader understanding of the complex nature, and there's the added factor that a lot of the things that I talk about, especially in the beginning of the book when I was a kid, I am now older than my parents were when that was happening.
Yeah,
So I've experienced a bit more life, and I understand things differently. So I know how difficult it was for them in a way that I didn't when I was young, when I was just reacting with anger.
yeah,
And so now I understand a lot more, and I'm able to approach it. So in that way, yeah, absolutely. It allowed me to see things from a different angle, and that is always helpful to a person like me.
for sure. And obviously, I want people to go out and get the book. But at the same time, is there anything you'd like to share about your story? Um, the idea of basically why you came to write a book about it?
I will say this, and I talk about it a little bit in Paper Cuts, the book I recently did. Uh, there was a great deal of time that I hid the fact that I was Native. I grew up in a white suburb, and I was the only Native person I knew aside from my sister in any of my classes. In my entire high school, I don't think there was one other Native person other than the two of us. And it wasn't popular. It wasn't cool in 1990, 1988,
Right.
1986 to be different or to be Native. And so as a survival instinct, I just kept it to myself. And that followed into adulthood because um, anytime somebody found out that I was Native, I I was bombarded with the most absurd and aggravating questions you could imagine. I've heard so many outrageous things. Well, why don't you wear feathers in your hair?
Oh,
Literally.
no.
Um, did you grow up in a teepee? Do you eat bison burger? You know, uh, and let's see. I don't know. No, and yes, I have.
Maybe you just need like a card you can take out. No, I don't live in a TP. All
Yeah,
the answers to those questions.
yeah.
And by the way, did the Ho Chunk live in TPs? I don't know.
We were more of what we call Chiputake people. They're like what most people would know as a wigwam, like
Yeah,
a
okay.
lodge type house. Yeah.
Yeah,
Uh,
so see, and that's why I'm asking that because there are non-natives out there that don't realize all Native Americans didn't always grow up in teepees. There were different types of housings by different tribes. And also, they didn't all wear headdresses. What were some of the other things you would hear?
oh, did you go to school for free? Do you pay taxes?
Oh, is
Uh,
there a money tree just flowing money down? Yeah.
yeah, I heard you don't pay taxes. People who are genuinely curious, I can answer with some patience
Yeah.
I'll say, hey, there's many nations, and you know, I hear people say, hey, I know a Ho Chunk, and he was a drunk guy that
Mm.
didn't have a job, and I'm like, well, there are many people as well inside those nations, and we are all remarkably different as well. The point is that recently, and especially since Standing Rock, I found uh, I found that I could no longer hide
Mm.
the fact that I was a native. That I shouldn't hide behind my Irish name. My dad is Irish. I should let my hair grow and let people recognize that I'm native rather than
Good.
let them mistake me for every other ethnicity with brown hair. So it was time for me to own who I am and to wear it with pride rather than try and slink around in the shadows, and which is what I felt like I've been doing for a long time.
I'm very proud of you for that.
And
So, what
yeah,
is Come Home Indio about?
oh boy, I mean, how can you encapsulate somebody's life struggles in a elevator pitch? I would say that the overarching theme, which I was unaware of until long after it was done, was just a feeling of not feeling like I belonged anywhere.
Mm.
Because my dad is Irish, and I was raised around a lot of white folks and non-natives, and I spent time with my native family as well. But they stayed with each other up north, and I came back down here. So it was never I never felt like uh, part of the team on at any point.
Yeah.
As I got older and became a little more aware, and there's a great deal of talk about alcoholism in there. I struggled with that for a great deal of time, and I've been in recovery for almost 19 years now. But there was a decade and a half of absolute numbing out, inability to deal with things, and
Yeah.
so it's about figuring out where I belong, and ultimately, I belong exactly wherever I am at any point. That's where I belong.
I love that. You have the right to be wherever you are.
Yeah,
Darn it. Probably
mostly.
more right than some.
Well, yeah.
So you once
Right?
told me that a teacher in New Zealand is using your memoir in his classroom, and that's a great idea for teachers who may be watching this today. What age group is appropriate for this comic in case some teachers want to look into it?
Yeah, I'd say that it's a safely 16 plus.
Okay,
It's definitely dealing with a lot of mature themes, and
gotcha.
and the language is complex, and I'm not talking about I'm using 10-cent words. I'm saying I'm using colloquialisms that I heard at that time. So there's offensive stuff in there. I do try to explain a lot of things that maybe aren't very well known, like we were discussing before, like the Carlisle School, and I still educate people uh, all the time about what residential schools are. They just have no clue that
Which is
they.
always shocking to me.
We'll be back after this quick break. Are you in the medical field looking for your next opportunity? Listeners, I'm proud to introduce you to Native American veteran-owned staffing company, Worldwide Medical Staffing. Owner and CEO Jackson Weaver is a citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma and is a service-connected disabled veteran, where he and his team staff for commercial healthcare and government entities such as the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, and DHS, and specialize in staffing Indian Health and VA hospitals nationwide. Isn't it nice to know that our veterans are being cared for by staff who have been handpicked by a veteran who's been in the staffing business for 17 years? Healthcare job seekers, check out these open jobs on www.medical.com. If you're seeking temporary, long-term, or permanent placement of physicians, advanced practice, registered nurses, and more, check out www.medical.com. And Diako Ki to our medical professionals and to those who have served our country.
I'd like to learn more about Paper Cuts. I really enjoyed reading it. The illustrations are so well done. My dad was the art teacher at Riverside Indian School, where we grew up, and in Anadarko. And so I have such an appreciation for you artists out there that are doing your thing. And there were several parts that really hit me hard and made me think. So we'll get into that in a second. But this book started with a residency here in Chicago, right? Tell us about that.
Yeah, I was approached by the good folks at the Newberry Library, which I had never been in until they asked to meet me.
Okay.
It's an imposing place. It's on the Gold Coast on the north side of the Loop in the city, and it's an area I don't spend a ton of time in. It's a large sort of it's a grand building. You know, it's grand. It looks beautiful from the outside, but it
Yeah.
also feels inaccessible. I had no
Okay.
idea that it was open to the public. I just
I've
never.
never been either. Now I'm going to, though.
Well, try to make it before January because that's as long as the exhibit is up for.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So they approached me, and basically they got myself and two other indigenous artists, Camille Billy, who is Oneida from Wisconsin, and Jason Weesaw of Potawatomi from Michigan. And they gathered the three of us and said, "Here is this huge collection of indigenous writing written by anything that mentions a native, basically, is in this collection." And they said, "So go ahead, read what you will, and make something."
And it could be anything.
Yeah, I mean, it was intimidating because they didn't know what they wanted, and I didn't know what to give them.
At the
And
same time, it would also be fun to be like, the world's my oyster. I can do whatever I want.
well, I get snowblind when I see a blank page like that with nothing to
Oh,
nowhere to. Uh, so
I
I
get it.
like jumping off point, and I had no idea where to start with the research either. And
Yeah.
what should I be reading? I I started reading spooky stuff. What kind of scary stories can I read?
Yeah,
And
like folklore and stuff, or
yeah, yeah, what they call mythology. I'm a year-round spooky guy. I think it has a lot to do with growing up in those Wisconsin woods as a young boy, and
yeah.
all the stories that I used to hear about spirits and things that live in those woods. Anyways, I spent a lot of time barking down that alley and realized that I was just reading to enjoy. I wasn't learning much or like pursuing it in any way. So I started concentrating on Ho Chunk history. We, in my family at least, and I'm kind of hesitant to talk about this because feelings are still involved. But my grandmother was in a residential school, and she came out of there a Catholic, and that's how she raised my mom and her brothers and sisters, and that is how they raised us. My mom didn't raise us Catholic. She raised us as, hands off spiritual world. We're not getting involved in all that.
Okay.
So I did not grow up hearing the stories passed down. I did not grow up hearing about our history.
Mm.
That residential school effectively chopped the legs out of two generations. And by the time it got to me, I had to rely on books. And ironically, a lot of those books were written by colonizers.
Yes, it is the frustration of many Native Americans that we don't always know what we're reading is actually accurate.
Yeah, because there wasn't the written language at the time, and so these stories were passed down phonetically and verbally, and a lot of these, sometimes good-hearted, sometimes not, people would record these things, and that is how that is how they come to us who have had to skip a couple generations to hear this stuff.
Mhm.
And and you know, you can't really count on it being what it's supposed to be, you know, because you don't have somebody teaching it to you. A lot of these stories, you read them, and I'm like, I don't understand what happened there. I don't get it at all. It floated above my head like a cloud, and it never touched me. I don't understand what happened
Right.
because I don't have an elder telling that story and explaining to me what it means, because the way of living back then as it applies to the story no longer exists. So
Yeah.
how do I apply that story to the way I have to live in this world? And you know, we're all just doing our best
I
and trying to figure it
know.
out as we go.
I mean, even the photos can be deceiving because a lot of times they would romanticize the way the person was looking. They might put a headdress on a native that doesn't wear headdresses just to get a photograph that was really cool. So that's frustrating too.
There's a fantastic book by one of my relatives, "People of the Big Voice," and it's that's what Ho Chunk means, and and so it's a collection of photographs that he found, Tom Jones, and I think there's
Okay.
another author, but that's off the top of my head. That he found in an old, you know, photography studio
No
from,
way.
you know, and it was Ho Chunks that would come in and get their pictures taken. But oftentimes they would be wearing something that they thought looked cool, that
Oh
wasn't
my God.
necessarily reflective of our traditional wear, you know. So there's
They're
headdresses.
probably like, you want me to put this on? Why?
Yeah, yeah. It's like, hey, I
That's
really
really
like this thing.
interesting though.
I'm gonna wear this, and okay. And now it's like, yeah, of course we wore those, and did we? You know, so
I know, right? It's like
yeah,
you can't trust anything.
I know. But at the
So, and
same,
it was like in this collection, there was photographs, manuscripts. I assume there were writings in there from maybe, say, a European that had come into this area and was just writing down what they saw. Is that kind of
yeah,
the stuff you
yeah.
were
And
saying?
in the exhibit itself, they have like the plea of the red man, I believe it's called, and it was like one of the first books written by a native person addressing white folks or non-natives, and
Oh,
the plea of the situation. And it is ancient. It is, you know, it's 100 and geez, almost 150, 170 years old at this point, you know.
wow.
um
Did you get to read that one or is it just on display?
that one's just on display, you know,
Oh,
in a glass case.
I'm trying to know what's in it. I noticed that the library does have a lot of it digitized now, which is great.
They do. They've been scanning that stuff in for some time. It's got to be an incredibly tedious process, but
Oh,
no, they have
thank God for the volunteers, right?
yeah, they have the treaty of the Chicago, like how Chicago was initially signed over, and you know they have all that stuff. And then there's my little comic book included in it, and it's really humbling to feel like they included me in this rich history of indigenous activity in this area, because Ho Chunks are from Chicago as well, you know.
Right? And the way that you described that in Paper Cuts, it was beautiful how you did it, trying to imagine like you love this city, but you also can try to imagine, I think you're in a canoe or something going down a river and you're trying to imagine what is this what it looked like before all this happened? Can't
Yeah,
even imagine. To me, to think of a city like this going backwards in time is just it's really hard for my brain to grasp.
I mean it's difficult for most of us because it's, at least in our lifetimes, that that kind of wild natural terrain is, it's all owned now. So
Yep.
it doesn't- that doesn't exist anymore. You know, there are still unceded sections of Chicago that are still in dispute on occasion and ongoing.
Really?
Yeah, like, I think the Grant Park area, it was it was created artificially And so that land did not exist when the treaty was signed. So now that that land does exist, it's considered unceded land. So
No way. I didn't know
yeah,
that. There's a guest of mine, Rance Wariakwi, who's Comanche, and he told the story about University of Oklahoma. That's where he went to school, and he's a professor there now too. And he said that where the football field is, there were so many buffalo wallows there where the buffaloes would roll around that they had to fill in those holes with dirt to be able to create the field. And it's just like, wow, when you're watching a football game, can you imagine take away all of that and just put some buffaloes out there? It's just such a different world, you know?
I know. I mean, Chicago, it means a place that smells like wild onions. That's what Chicago means. There were tons of wild onions that grew here, and it was all marsh. It was all connected to the lake, and the lake extended. It didn't just end abruptly the way that it does now. Buffering against a skyscraper. It was wetlands, and it was filled with all kinds of bird and insect life that just don't exist anymore. They don't have a place. So, as much as I love this city, my heart breaks when I think about those things.
So at Newberry Library, there was a donor named Mr. Ayers. He was a lumber baron. He's the one that donated those documents, photographs, and all that. And I'll talk more about that in a bit. But the very first thing I noticed in paper cuts was your use of the word "enit." And then I knew I had to read on. That's definitely a word I grew up around and said in my home state. For people who may not know what "enit," ENIT in this case means, it's like, ain't it, isn't it? It's kind of like we used to say, "Enna guy," which was, ain't it, Indian guy? Sounds so silly me saying it that way, but when I read that, I was like, oh, this is going to be so good.
I that was something that I grew up with as well, and it's just a colloquialism that just immediately tells me that we're going to understand each other.
We're on the same page.
Yeah, and I can't tell you how blown away I was when I read "The Lone Ranger and Tonto: Fist Fight in Heaven" by Sherman Alexie, and I must have read that. I don't know. I was in my early 20s, I believe, and he
Yeah.
said it, his characters are saying in it.
No way.
Yeah, and I was like, oh my god, this guy really is native, you know.
That's
And
the mark. Yeah.
that connection is important. And again, like a non-native person might read that and be like, I don't understand that. Just a native who grew up hearing that is like, okay, I can trust that this person at least knows that much, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And another one is a.
It doesn't matter what nation you're from.
No, right.
Those seem
Everybody
universal.
said it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember when I moved to from Oklahoma to Indiana. At first, I would say "a," and people would look at me weird. And then some people would ask me if I was from Canada, like "a,"
Like
which it's
EA.
more of an "a."
Yeah.
So I'm like, no, that's. So I realized people didn't, non-natives that I met in Indiana did not say that word. That was my first chance to realize that that was not a normal word amongst most people in the
Oklahoma.
U.S.
Yeah.
In paper cuts, you seem to go back and forth with like conflicting thoughts and emotions as a native person and what you are supposed to feel about where you live in this land that was taken from your ancestors. So can you expand on that for our listeners who haven't read it yet?
Well, I'm not sure if conflicted is the right way to put that for me at least.
Okay.
I I I, I struggle with it for sure.
Uh-huh.
I have a fairly I have a fairly solid idea of who I am now, and I have a solid idea of where I come from, and I have a growing sense of what it meant for me to be here.
Mm.
And by that I mean what my people had to go through so that I could live today, and that gives me a different sense of where I belong.
Stay tuned for part 2 of this series.
Thanks for listening to Native Chalk Talk. Be sure to join our community on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and check us out at nativechalktalk.com. Stay tuned for the next episode. You're going to love it. Yakoki. Thank you, my friends.